welcome to the Pragati Vichar Literature Festival 2024, the Authors Marathon. This is Drishti, the media representative of Frontlist Media. And today, the theme for our session is Biography and Memoir. The name for the session is Pioneers of Social Reform, Unveiling the Lives of Ambedkar and Savitribai Phule. Now, I'd like to welcome our eminent panelist, Mr. Aakash Singh Rathore and Ms. Reeta Ramamurthy Gupta. A very warm welcome to you both.
Thank you.
How are you both feeling today?
Wonderful and happy to be here.
Okay, what about you, Aakash, sir?
Yeah, very good. I can't say I'm feeling physically well because I just finished, I don't know if you know what an Ironman triathlon is, but I finished it on day before yesterday in Phu Quoc in Vietnam and came back. So wow. I can't walk today, but I should be able to talk.
That is all we like to hear from you. Okay, so we're very honored to have you both here. Let me introduce you to our audience. Okay, starting with Mr. Aakash Singh Rathore. Mr. Aakash Singh Rathore is a philosopher of international repute and author of 9 books, including the just released Becoming Baba Saheb, a definitive biography. He has also edited over a dozen books, ranging from political philosophy and law to literature and religion. His Hedges India was shortlisted for the Non-Fiction Book of the Year at the Tata Literature Live Book Awards 2017. Professor Rathore has taught politics, philosophy, and law at premier institutions such as Jawaharlal Nehru University, University of Delhi, UPenn and Rutgers University, among others. A very warm welcome to you, Mr. Aakash Singh Rathore. And for our next panelist, Ms. Reeta. Ms. Reeta Ramamurthy Gupta is a best-selling author and a reviewer for Network 18. She is an active proponent of the philosophy that the right mindset can help people rescript their own lives as well as that of others. She is credited with the acclaimed Red Dot Experiment, a 10-year-long 6-nation study on how culture impacts communication. A polyglot, she speaks 5 languages. She has just published her book on the life of Savitribai Phule. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much.
Now, let us start with our session. My first question to you both is, what motivated you to delve into the life of Ambedkar and Savitribai Phule? Also, what impact do you think their lives and work have had on modern India? Let's start with Mr. Aakash.
Okay, thank you for the question. As we were speaking just before we started recording, I actually got into Ambedkar's life because of the family I married into. My wife's family is a Ambedkarite family, and I was not raised, being from very different background, was quite ignorant about Baba Sahib. Despite, as I had mentioned, I also was at Columbia University like he was. I am also a lawyer like he was, and I was also at LSE like he was. And it's quite embarrassing as I look back that our lives, or my life, overlapped with his in so many ways, and I was completely ignorant about him when I was younger. So that changed about 20 years ago when I was married with my wife in what was basically a Navayan Buddhist ceremony, much to my own surprise and the surprise of my family and so on. So all of these necessitated, really delving into this subculture of my wife's family, and that meant exploring Ambedkar not only intellectually but also sort of socially and personally. And after 20 years, that materialized as this kind of portrait of Ambedkar, not as a merely a political figure or a statesman or a social reformer or any one particular thing, but trying to understand the person in 360 degrees. It comes more or less from a personal need to understand him so completely in order to really understand my my wife's family, community, and culture better. So it's been, 2 decades journey, and it's been quite remarkable. And at least my own children will not be as ignorant as I was when I was growing up.
What are your thoughts on this, Reeta ma'am?
I had just written the biography of Sanjeev Kumar, the actor we all loved. And my daughter turned around and asked me a question. Being a woman, why are you writing about men all the time? And that was my first trigger. I know it's a very banal trigger when you look at the scheme of things and the work of Savitribai Phule. But I thought that I must write about the woman because of whom I can write, because of whom I can read, because of whom my daughter can read. And that really was the beginning of my journey to look into Savitribai Phule. And then I had an intern somewhere in 2019, just before COVID. And I said, okay, let's start, looking at the data available on Savitribai Phule and how many books are there about her. And she said there is precious little. And she also uncovered this other figure for me from history. She said, ma'am, have you heard of Fatima Sheikh? So I said, no, I haven't heard of Fatima Sheikh. So she said she started all the 18 schools along with Savitribai Phule. So here I was thinking, not only do we not know enough about Savitribai Phule, but she also had this comrade in arms about whom we know precious little. And that really was the beginning of my journey. And from there on to, of course, 2023, where the book released, I have traveled the length and breadth of the country. I think in Chennai, people were unaware of Savitribai Phule's work. In Calcutta, people were unaware of her work. In some parts of Haryana that I spoke to, people were unaware of her work. And I felt extremely sad that the work of India's first lady teacher seemed somehow limited to being Maharashtra's first lady teacher in some sense. And that was the trigger for me to write this in English and take it to as many people as possible.
It's always very interesting to know how an author gets the origin thought. So let's move on with the next question. Can you share insights into your research process for crafting these biographies, and what were the most challenging aspects of researching and writing about Ambedkar and Savitribai Phule's lives? Let's start with ma'am.
Okay, so as I said, in Marathi, there was a fair amount of information available about Savitribai Phule. So also the other thing that we all need to remember is the importance of documentation. Savitribai Phule wrote poems. She two books of poems actually, Kavya Phule and Bhavan Kashi Ratnakar. And I could at least interpret her voice through her poems. You know, Purane Zamane mein we used to have these Raja Maharajas getting their portraits clicked and then hung on the wall. And in the times of the internet, we may not realize how important it was. But how will we remember them once they are not there? Unfortunately, Fatima Sheikh never wrote. She was an educated woman. She kept working, but she left no imprint of her existence or her work. But for this one picture that I found, 1910, this was published in Majur newspaper, which had Savitribai, Fatima Sheikh, and Sagunabai Shirsagar, the three women behind the Education for All movement in the country. So, as far as Savitribai was concerned, there was some material available. As far as Fatima Sheikh was concerned, there was precious little available. I had to speak to a lot of historians to create some kind of a construct through oral evidence that this might have been the case, and then propose that to my reader, that this could have been her situation, these might have been her thoughts, this was evidence of her migration. So we had to literally put together piece by piece the life she might have had and offer that to our reader. Again, as far as Sagunabai was concerned, all that was known was that Jyotirao Phule's mother died very young, and she stepped in as mother to Jyotirao Phule, Savitribai Phule's husband. And all we know is that she tried to start a school which was shut down. But again, through, I guess, the historians who are almost 92, 93 years old and still agreed to meet me and speak to me about what could have been the context of those times. What could have been the situations they faced? How did they live? And what were their concerns at that time? So, piecing this together was really vital for me because, like you rightly said, you didn't know much about Savitribai Phule. At the same time, you and I both owe her. Every Desi woman living anywhere in the world who can read and write owes her. Not just her, but also Fatima Sheikh and also Sagunabai. So it became a consuming passion for me to put this together in context. That's what I'd like to say.
Very well said. Mr. Akash, what are your thoughts on this?
Yes, thanks. Rita had, quite. I'm actually very touched by what Rita said in reply to the first question about why you asked by her daughter, why are you always writing about a woman? When I was raising my two daughters are now a bit older, but when they were in their, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years that I would like to read them stories as they were falling asleep, I always was at a loss for finding stories about great women models and precursors like Savitribai Phule. So I'm so glad that research like this is done so that we have things that we can read to our daughters to inspire them.
Thank you.
Anyway, moving on, there's so much missing information, as Rita said, about Savitribai and others. That's not the case with Ambedkar. It's not missing information. It's an overabundance of information and misinformation. So this was the real challenge for writing the biography. There's no shortage of biographies of Ambedkar. In fact, one might say, why would you write another one? And the real reason is that, as many biographies as they are, they boil down to essentially two sources. One in English, which is Dhananjay Keer's biography, and one in Marathi, a very vast one by Kharmode. And the Kharmode biography it's 12 volumes. It's never been translated into English. And the Keer biography, which is in English, is so full of mistakes and misinformation if you follow the footnotes in my book, it's not an academic book, but I kept a list of notes of how many errors there are in these two founding biographies, one in English that all subsequent biographers up to Shashi Tharoor's recent one, that they all rely upon here, and all of the Marathi biographers, which number into the scores, if not hundreds, which are all based on Kharmode. And the mistakes on Keer and Kharmode are on every page. Now, it's not from a lack of trying, and I'm not blaming them. Remember, they're writing in the 1950s, a period where information was so scarce. Kharmode did his best to try to verify information. He wrote to the London School of Economics. He wrote to Columbia University. And as I found by traveling to those archives, they misinformed him. The poor man, he tries to write LSE, for example, what degrees did Dr. Ambedkar get from there? And LSE sent him the wrong information. So, there's so much misinformation that has been going around since the 1950s about Ambedkar. The real problem in writing a biography when there's an abundance of information is to sort the fact from the misinformation. And that was really, there were two main projects in my biography. One was to get to Ambedkar as a human being, as a person, as a man, as opposed to as a demigod and a hero and a saint and whatever else people might think of him, which are all in some ways true, but they nevertheless don't capture him as a person. So that was one thing. And the second was to sort out the fact from the fiction, because there's so much fiction. And if I've come, close in either of these two things, I think the project was worthwhile.
Like you just revealed the mistakes and the misinterpretation already going around. One can just feel how much work and heart has been put into your work. That's really commendable. Moving on to the next question. How would you describe the role of Ambedkar and Savitribai Phule in the social reform movements of their time? In your opinion, what are the most significant aspects of their work in the context of social justice and education? Let's start with Sir.
Yes, well, Ambedkar was a product of his time. He was a product, of course, of the Phules as well. He devoted or dedicated his book on the Shudras to Mahatma Phule. But there is an interesting oversight, which I have to admit never really occurred to me until learning about Reeta's book, which is a question I have to solve when I complete the second volume of the biography. Why Baba Sahib dedicated the book only to Mahatma Phule and not both Savitribai and Mahatma Phule? And my guess would be that he was not actually aware of the work that she had done. And if that's true, I can't say that it's true, but if that's true, that suggests that Reeta is fixing, a problem that goes back 100 years. Anyway, Ambedkar had inherited so much from the Satyashodak movement, a bit from the non-Brahmin movement in the South, and he was carrying forward a torch that was already burning very, very bright. But the social reform movements in Maharashtra and in the South at that time were also lacking an intellectual rigor. And I think one of the main things that Ambedkar contributed and why he managed to transform and sharpen the movement, at least in Maharashtra, so profoundly, was precisely because of the intellect and organizational skills that he brought to bear on the vastness of the movement. So there were many conferences, depressed classes conferences. There was already a newspaper, Muknayak. There were already newspapers like the ones that Ambedkar would soon himself start. Some of them even having the same name, and Ambedkar just borrowed these names, these journals and papers. But what Ambedkar did was he brought all of these into a profound intellectual rigor that would take on the greatest minds of his day. So as we know, during Ambedkar's teens and 20s and 30s, the real interest shifted from social reform to political freedom. But there were two freedom movements going on. There was not only the freedom movement in terms of decolonization, the national movement, there was also the freedom movement in terms of social justice, as you had mentioned. And a dualism began to emerge in the 1920s, 1930s, that if you were still focusing on social justice instead of devoting your time to political freedom, then you were betraying the national movement. And so just imagine that Ambedkar and the legacies, those who inherited the traditions of the Phules and the non-Brahmin movement and the Satyashodak and so on, they did not only have the challenges of caste and gender and class to face, they even had to overcome their own compatriots in trying to convince them that they're fighting for a movement that is the social movement that is just as important as the freedom movement.
Wonderful.
What would be your perspective on this question?
I'm so delighted that Rathorji said that his book is not academic. And it's extremely important. What he said we need more people to read and understand and talk about it. The quality of conversations in a democracy is a direct reflection of what people read. And the simpler we make history, the better it is for your generation in particular, isn't it? So I'm going to start by quoting Ambedkar, whom I have quoted in my book. This has, a lot of bearing on what he spoke about. Chaturvarna, that is the four castes, would have been a very innocent principle if it meant no more than dividing society into four classes. Unfortunately, more than this is involved. Besides dividing society into four orders, the theory goes further and makes the principle of graded inequality. So you understand the difference. It's not just ki ye tiger hai, ye lion hai. It's not that. It is, this is a tiger, so the tiger can study. This is a lion, so the lion has to sweep the floor. So it is not categorization. It is graded inequality. And when is this? This is less than 200 years ago. You understand? So the impact of this, the impact of Savitribai Phule's work is phenomenal to me. Less than 200 years ago, if you were born a woman, you couldn't study. Simple. You wouldn't be here having this conversation and moderating this discussion. Now, the other part of Chaturvarna that you need to understand is that Brahmins at the time, and I'm saying some of them because some of them actually joined Jyotirao Phule in his movement, had interpreted the Shastras to their advantage. So if you were a Shudra, for example, you would have to wear a pot below your neck. Because if the spit or your sweat goes down to the floor and God forbid a Brahmin walks on it, anarth ho jayega, right? If you were a Shudra, you would have to wear a black thread around your neck to announce that you were a Shudra. And again, if you were a Shudra, Ati Shudra, Mahar, Manga, any of those castes, you were allowed to walk outside your house at very select times so that no Brahmin encounters you on his way. This is the situation of society and women less than 200 years ago. Now just look around you and tell me that Savitribai Phule's work has not impacted our world. I think I can safely rest my case on this, isn't it? There is so much more, but I'll answer that in the next question.
Very rightfully, sir. So for the next question, how would you summarize the lasting legacy of Ambedkar and Savitribai Phule, and why is it important for current and future generations? Pam, would you like to start? We were just
Certainly.
talking about this.
I read a book by Lawrence James. It was just called Raj. Okay. And he poses a very important question. He says that there were 80 million people in India. Okay. And 17,000 British soldiers. Just compare. 80 million Indians, 17,000 British soldiers, out of which half of them were either opium addicted or alcohol addicted or invalid or unable to serve in whatever capacity. Okay. So less than 10,000 fit British soldiers are governing 80 million people. For me, this was somehow connected to Savitribai's movement. Because this data that I'm telling you is 1836. Savitribai is born in 1831 and she sets up her first school in 1848. Less than 100 years later. In fact, 99 years later, we become independent. Right? In 1947. It looks very simplistic when I put it this way. I understand that. But I encourage you to think about it. If less than 10,000 soldiers can govern 80 million people, and 100 years after starting the first school, we get independence, something moved. Right? We learned to behave as a collective. We learned to think in terms of liberty, equality, social justice, a point that Rathorji brought out so beautifully. Does it have to be a toss-up between do we fight for our country and do we fight for social justice? Or did the two fights move parallelly and somewhere conclude in 1947? Right? So their legacy is far-reaching. And we just need to admire and appreciate the shoulders that we stand on, the work of those that came before us. And that will also help us value the freedoms we have today.
Yeah, we are surely experiencing their legacy right now, sitting here. So, what would be your answer to this question?
I think there are a lot of ways to answer the question. One can see today in politics increasing polarization, sort of dehumanization of your political opponent. I personally won't hide it because I think anyone who Googles me knows I'm a bit of a left-wing fanatic. And on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now, there will be trolls who, call me every kind of name because of it. And there will be people on the right whom I regard as, in my meaner moments as less than equally human to me, and so on. So these kinds of political polarization is an area where Baba Saheb's own way of negotiating politics, I think, is very very useful. There's a thematic approach that he took, which was that he was not on the left, he was not on the right, he was in favor of justice. And whichever political inclination, political ideology anyone happened to follow, the true test was not, is this person on my team, but is this person's position furthering, advancing the cause of justice? And I think this kind of attitude is a way of providing something of a solution in today's political polarization, because it's the last thing that we think of today about our political opponent. Is she or he pursuing justice, just as I am attempting to do? And if so, why should I, bully, batter, beat, and mob such a person simply because they have a different believe in a different means to the same end? So there's this political usage, but there's also many other ways of resurrecting the spirit of Baba Saheb's thought today. I just want to read, when a author writes and is publishing a book, they often ask endorsements from people they admire. I had asked Tenmosi Sundararajan, who leads the equality labs in the United States, for an endorsement on my book. And I'm just going to read one line that she wrote, because it has always surprised and moved me in a way. So she writes at the end of her endorsement: by becoming Baba Saheb, for yourself and for a young person you care about, for it introduces Ambedkar to a new generation at a time when his lessons are more important than ever. And I was really puzzled by that. So I kept thinking about, why does she say this? Why does she say that the lessons of Ambedkar are more important now than ever? And if you look at the context in the United States where she works now, it's possible that anyone in the audience knows that the US has been moving anti-caste bills. For example, the California Senate passed an anti-caste bill, which the governor then vetoed. And a very prominent Black writer wrote a book on race in America, which she entitled Caste. So in the United States, as we know, just as in India, caste has been such a long-standing problem. In the United States, race has been such a long-standing problem. And interestingly, just in the last 5 to 7 years, Black activists and intellectuals and scholars and politicians in the United States have been beginning to talk about the race problem in the US as a caste problem. In the process, have been quoting Baba Sahib Ambedkar as well as the Phules to talk about the nature of caste and how it creates pseudo-biological differences out of social differences. So I think this is quite fascinating that Ambedkar's legacy or contemporary importance is not only one that is, of enduring significance in India, but I think the last decade has shown is now becoming globally significant. And the ways that he introduced novel problems to long-standing and novel solutions to long-standing problems, other people are starting to borrow from and to get inspired from, whether in the United States or South Africa or elsewhere, in order to think in new ways about their own issues. So Ambedkar's importance to contemporary social justice is not limited to India. It's become global, and as any of us know who work in India, once something Indian becomes global, it becomes all the more important in India once again.
Yeah, very rightfully said. Actually, I had a friend from Sri Lanka who knew Ambedkar, and I was really surprised to know that. But he already knew about Ambedkar's works and the caste system and everything. So I was really stoked to know that his works are so global. So yeah, moving on. How has writing these biographies impacted your own perspective and understanding of social reform and historical figures like Ambedkar and Savitribai Phule? Let's start from ma'am.
I think it has been life-changing, spending 4 years with Savitribai Phule. I was in London just 6 months ago. I'm going to start there. There was a lady who bought a book to me about women who changed history. It was not by an Indian. And she said, hey, there are 2 pages on Savitribai Phule in this. So I said, oh, let me take a look. And she says that the suffragette movement, that is the right to vote, that movement in the late 19th century, early 19th century, had an entire contingent that was taught by students of Savitribai Phule. So the impact of their work, 1848 is when they set up the first school. And 50 years later, when the suffragette movement happens, you have a women's contingent who is fighting for the right to vote, an Indian women's contingent in London. So I found this piece of data fascinating. And obviously, I want more evidence on it before we can probably bring out a book too on Savitribai's global impact across the world. But I think I'd like to start with saying that I realized how practical you have to be, how persistent you have to be if you are completely committed to a cause. Jyotirao Phule actually took contracts from the British government to fund the schools. In fact, he built the Yeravda Bridge, the Mula Mutha Dam, which are still in Pune. So he became a government contractor in order to get money to run these schools. Look at Savitribai Phule. Savitri and Fatima both were taught by a missionary named Cynthia Farrar. So what happens is, if you are taught by a missionary, their own people wondered, they transformed in some way? Are they still my own? Have they converted? So in that environment, Savitribai sets up an entire Haldi Kunku festival and launches a Mahila Seva Mandal. She says, I'm still your own. Look at how practical these women are. They understand perception. What are people thinking about me? How do I get more and more people to join my movement? They are constantly thinking. They are not saying, oh, this is my point of view. If you agree, you join. If you don't agree, you go somewhere else. No. They know that unless they have support of a lot of people, they cannot really make the movement successful, right? Every single day when they are traveling to school, they are pelted with cow dung, they are pelted with mud, they are pelted with stones. They just carried another sari and said, okay, we'll change in school. How practical, how cognizant of perception, and how much perseverance these women had. And I think these lessons are perhaps management lessons that modern companies and modern employees could also learn from.
Lovely. I'd love to hear your perspective on this, sir.
Yes, I think taking the cue from two things that Reeta said that I think really overlap with my experience. If you know anything about Ambedkar, or what his biographers have long for many decades claimed, and in fact that film by Jabir Patel on Dr. Ambedkar, all of these suggest that when young Ambedkar was studying at Columbia University in New York, the Harlem Renaissance, the black sort of black rights, black power movement was starting, and he befriended some black people who were pursuing their rights for racial equality, and he got inspired for his own movement when he returned to India from this Harlem Renaissance and black civil rights movement. Now, unfortunately, none of this is true. When Dr. Ambedkar was in New York City in the 19-teens, there was no black power movement. There was Harlem was a white area at that time, and you have to just think about it this way: would the Americans build Columbia University? It's this Ivy League university in the middle of a black neighborhood. Obviously not. It was a white neighborhood at that time. It was only about 10 years after Ambedkar left New York when, because of Jim Crow laws in the South of the United States, the blacks started moving so much into the northern cities and places like New York City that Harlem became completely black, and then the Harlem Renaissance took off and so on. Now, okay, so we correct the record there. Ambedkar wasn't inspired by this movement. So then what was it that he was inspired by in New York? And here's what I find so fascinating with what Reeta said, because when I went to New York City to study in the archives at Columbia and tried to figure out what was influencing Ambedkar, I discovered that Dr. Ambedkar's doctoral supervisor and his favorite teacher, John Dewey, had encouraged him to march in a suffragette march on Fifth Avenue in New York City, where there were many women riding on horseback, leading 10,000 protest marchers up from Washington Square towards in the direction north towards where the university is. And I found out that Ambedkar's PhD supervisor had him sit with a suffragette named Mabel Lee and learn from her about the women's rights movement. And it was this, in fact, not the Black civil rights movement, it was the women's rights movement that had inspired Dr. Ambedkar to write about caste in his first academic paper called, his very, very famous early paper from Columbia University on the genesis of the caste system in India. And what he writes there was shocking, because sociologists all talk about caste and untouchability as being an issue of purity and pollution. And Ambedkar, in his earliest paper, said, no, caste is about the control of women's sexuality. And where did he come up with such an idea? Precisely from the suffragette movement and the women that he met at Columbia University who were fighting for women's rights. So I was very happy, thrilled to be able to correct the record about this early influence on Ambedkar. And I'm now more thrilled to find out there might be a full circle leading back to Savitribai, if indeed she was influential on some of the suffragettes in London who were clearly in communication with those in New York City.
Wow.
Yeah. So let's talk about let's circle back on this a year from now and see if we've come up with anything. Now, the second thing that the second thing that Reeta mentioned was about the perseverance and the tenacity, the strength of women like Savitribai Phule. And this is very clear in Ambedkar's own life. And I was also in some way changed by getting very deeply involved in Ambedkar's day-to-day life and learning the insults. You know, there's something that other biographers haven't pointed out. I counted throughout Ambedkar's life 10 assassination attempts on him. So 10 times when he was physically assaulted with the intent of murder. And the ways that these attempts were triggered at certain pivotal moments in his life, like the Mahad Satyagraha, when he led thousands of people towards drinking from a public well to assert the rights of untouchables to drink from public sources of water. He was of course attacked. We all know he was violently attacked at that time, but we you know, it's not common knowledge that there was an assassination attempt by a small Brahmin clan based in Mahad who wanted to teach him a lesson. Now, his own it's very difficult to state this succinctly without getting into all sorts of other pieces of the backstory. But he had a kind of a security team made of ex-Mahar soldiers who had learned about this assassination attempt and suggested to him that he needed to, you know, cool off and not go ahead with the movement. And he said, you know what, how many untouchables have died asserting their rights? It's a countless number. So why suddenly should I stand most in the limelight back down because of this risk of death? So these very valiant and courageous decisions that people like Savitribai Phule and certainly Babasaheb Ambedkar made, I think just reading about it as opposed to writing about it, just reading about it, you know, is inspirational, but writing about it is life-changing in a way, because you see that the person whose story you're trying to tell is a person whose story you have to do justice to in order to you know, not let these facts slip away. So I think this is something that you know, I would say it was most impactful, seeing the courage of the subject of these biographies.
If I may just add a line to what Rathorji said, you know, your endeavor is to put the reader in the same room as your protagonist. So you are literally getting into the skin of your protagonist and yet maintaining a distance, because only from distance will come objectivity. Your reader does not want to know, my reader does not want to know what I think about Savitribai Phule. They want to meet Savitribai Phule through my book. So keeping that objectivity, keeping that distance, yet immersing yourself and yet ensuring your reader is in the same room, I think that is the space we are in. And that is the justice we need to do.
It's great to see how many unknown facts and insights we're getting out of this discussion. Yeah, now I have a specific question for Reeta ma'am. Ma'am, Savitribai Phule made significant contributions to education, feminism, and social reform. What key movements or achievements do you think are often overlooked but should be acknowledged more widely?
The answer to this has been troubling me, if I can be very honest with you. Her contribution to India as a nation, her contribution to the development of the idea of nationhood, I think that is completely ignored. Today, if you talk about the intellectuals, who were the intellectuals of the Indian freedom movement? You might say Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, you might say Sarojini Naidu, you might say Subramanyam Bharati. So these are commonly acknowledged. Now, the important thing is that the intellectuals in Maharashtra or the Maratha Confederacy, they wrote in Marathi. Whereas the others wrote in English. Right? So this missing link, at that time we were ruled by the Britishers. Perhaps they could not read Marathi. Perhaps they did not appreciate the contributions. Perhaps they did not discuss what they did not understand. Right? The contribution of education for a privileged few to education for all, to the generation of the idea of nationhood. What is India? If you are uneducated, what do you know? Oh, I get up in the morning. This is my family. This is my house. This is the food that I eat. This is where I work, and this is where I answer nature's call. Okay, your existence is so limited. How will you discuss ideas like freedom? How will you conceive rights beyond the life you know? Can you think in terms of coming together for a movement? Can you think in terms of social justice? Can you think in terms of gender equality? You can't. So, when education spread from privileged few to all, people started appreciating values beyond their immediate existence. They could understand concepts. And this led to people coming together and fighting for what they believed was a human right. 1776, America gets independence. 1791, Thomas Paine wrote a book called Rights of Man. This was brought in 1813 to India by the missionaries after the Charter Act. And Jyotirao Phule read this book. What did it say? You don't need an intermediary to worship God. You can worship God on your own. Right? So George Washington wrote books that came to India after 1813 with the missionaries. So all these concepts, who will read them? Just the educated few, or will everyone read them? Right? So this change and this contribution to the idea of nationhood, this emancipation of the classes who were crippled by fear, that is Savitribai's real contribution in my view. And I think Rathorji will agree.
Wonderful. Sir, would you like to add something?
No, I mean, yes, I I agree very strongly with that. There's so many these questions that you've posed. There's so many different ways that they can be answered, and it's difficult to decide. Savitribai Phule, Baba Saheb Ambedkar, Mahatma Phule, they contributed so much in so many different ways to decide. I'm going to speak about this one is it's a very difficult decision to make, but I think Reeta is quite right on what she's pointed out.
So now my next question is for Sir. Sir, Dr. Ambedkar's legacy extends beyond his lifetime. In your opinion, what is the most significant aspect of his legacy, and how is it relevant to contemporary social issues?
I'm going to take the cue from how Reeta just answered that question, because when we speak about contemporary issues, we can also speak about the contemporary generation. As you yourself mentioned when you were introducing us, I taught at JNU for a few years. I also taught at Mumbai University and Hyderabad Central University and many other universities in India where the marginalized students from the marginalized communities, especially in the last, let's say, 5 years, have been increasingly expressing to me a kind of in not disaffection but almost despair. What few jobs there are going to go to those with social capital, people from the so-called higher castes and obviously from the higher classes and so on. What opportunities there are generally require that you have a godfather looking after you to move you into that space. And people from the marginalized communities obviously don't have godfather to elbow them into certain positions or opportunities. And so I've noticed in the last half decade for sure that my students from the marginalized community all over, whether it's Hyderabad or Bangalore or Mumbai or Delhi, that they have been expressing more and more and more despair and hopelessness. Now, not to depress you, I raise that issue because I think one of the key things that Baba Sahib introduces for this generation right now is, if you look at his life, go back 100 years ago. Rita had mentioned that, what position would a woman be in 150 years back? Obviously not entitled to education, so appearing in public and so on. Think back 100 years ago to what an untouchable, even man, was, what opportunities he had. So can a Dalit student today at JNU, let's say, who's despairing, can he reasonably suggest that his lot today, his position, is more precarious than Ambedkar's was 100 years ago when he was struggling? Can he say that materially he's less better off than Ambedkar was 100 years ago when, as I think everybody knows, Ambedkar wasn't able to finish his education because of the shortage of funds, and he had to come back to India and interrupt his attempt to get a PhD and so on. So, he was always in debt. In fact, Baba Sahib died in debt, despite all of his achievements and accomplishments. Can one say that he had better social resources, that he had a godfather, that he had any of the things that are missing, from the plight of marginalized students today? Obviously not. Now, I'm not downplaying what people are going through today. On the contrary, I'm suggesting that the lasting legacy of Ambedkar can be profoundly inspirational when one thinks that, okay, my situation today may be dire, but so was his. What did he do to transcend that situation and make such a lasting impression? And if you can assimilate those kinds of behaviors, those kinds of attitudes, those kinds of efforts into your own life, then I think you can transform this despair into a kind of hope. Now, I had mentioned very early on that I wanted to present Ambedkar as a man, as a person, instead of as a god or a hero or whatever. The entire reason behind that is because gods can accomplish anything. Gods can accomplish anything that no human being can accomplish. But when we understand that Ambedkar was just a man, was just a person, that means that you today, as I tell to any of my students today, that means that you today can also achieve something analogous, something similar. It doesn't even have to be something equal. Just, if you can do 10% of what he did, you'll transcend your despair and achieve things that are very promising for you and for those around you. So I think in some respects, the lasting legacy of Ambedkar can be as a kind of archetype or inspiration for the many, many millions of young, marginalized people today who feel that they have no avenue, no way of moving forward. You just look back at what people like Savitribai Phule, Baba Sahib Ambedkar, what conditions they were working in, and see that they were not any rosier than our own, quite the contrary. And yet, with their fortitude, with their perseverance, with their courage, with their spirit, with their unsatiable desire to change the world for the better, they managed to overcome all of their difficulties and in so many ways change the world for the better.
Very rightfully said. What I also have personally learned from them, both Savitribai Phule and Ambedkar ji, was that take adverse conditions to make it into a power and change the world. Take adversity and pioneer change. So yeah, they truly are very inspirational figures for me personally. So that were all the questions I had for today. Finally, now I'd also like you to show us your newly released books to the audience and also tell them why you think it will be a great read for them. Let's start with ma'am.
Well, that's very nice of you. I think that what I spoke about Savitribai Phule and her work as fundamental to the idea of nationhood being born. I think I tried to represent it in the cover itself. So you have Savitribai Phule in saffron, Sagunabai, a widow, in white, and Fatima Sheikh in green, and the children who joined their school in blue. So for me, I've tried to represent India on the cover of the book. And I truly believe that if a Hindu, a widow, and a Muslim, with Christian teachers teaching them, can come forth and generate this wonderful idea of nationhood, then we have so much to thank history for. And read this because it's a story and not because it's academic. Again, to pick from what Rathorji said.
Now, sir, would you like to introduce your book?
Yeah, that was so nice. I took a screenshot of you with the book, Reeta. So this is the cover of the biography, and I think I'm going to point out just one thing to answer the question. Here is a photograph which I think people really have never seen before. I found this in the archives in London. It is the passport photo of Dr. Ambedkar's 1932 passport, and
Wow.
The original is there, and I scanned it. Now, why is it important? For two reasons. One, I talked about the abundance of information and how much misinformation there is. Now, one thing that might shock you is in this passport, applied for in Ambedkar's own hand, I have all of the um, uh, uh, reproduced all of that inside in the photo plates. You see that Ambedkar lists his birth date as 1892, as opposed to 1891. We all celebrate his birthday on 14th April and believe he was born on 1891. Now, in his own letters to his second wife, he said that 14th April is not his birthday. And now we see on his own application for his passport, 1891 was not his birth year. So there's so much, that remains unexplored. I've tried to explain all of these things in the biography. But the second reason I find this photograph so interesting is because it's not flattering. It's not the kind of representation that we always get of Baba Sahib fully formed in the blue suit, holding the Constitution with his finger forward. This is a very human kind of, just a guy trying to get to London. So I like it very much. In fact, the publisher didn't want to use it precisely because it's not the most flattering picture. And I said, that's why I want to use it. Because I want to show that he started off like anybody else, but becoming Baba Sahib was, a Herculean task that took development step by step by step, and every step along the way, it might not have happened. When he describes when he was young, that he after his father remarried, he got so annoyed that his stepmother was wearing his mother's jewelry that he wanted to run off and become a mill worker in Bombay. And he attempted to do that. And it's not just a silly story. His brother was already a mill worker in Bombay. In fact, most of the untouchable communities were just common labor, either out on in the fields or in the proletariat of the city, like Bombay. So, before he was 10 years old, he might have just been a mill worker and not, the chief architect of the Constitution. And then, every step along the way, there are so many stories where there were different paths he could have taken. He didn't necessarily, he received a scholarship so that he could study, so he might not have been Dr. Ambedkar. He was unable to complete his law degree, so he might not have been Barrister Ambedkar. He didn't, the Mahad Satyagraha was something that he wasn't sure he was going to participate in because it was a direct action not only against his fellow Indian and freedom fighters, the Congress Party was against it, but also the government. So he might not have become Baba Sahib at all. So he might not have become all of these stages that we see in the evolution of becoming who he was. What I try to do in the book is show how each one of them was so precarious that they might not have happened. And yet, thanks to how history worked out, we got Baba Sahib in the end. So I wanted to show you that photograph because it captures really the human side, this person in the making, and this human side is what I take away from Ambedkar as a kind of personal inspiration.
Very authentic cover. Very authentic.
Yeah, truly. So wonderful. I'm sure the readers will truly enjoy your books. And that was all we had for today. It was truly a privilege to have such authors of such caliber with us here. The way you articulated your thoughts and presented it will surely be enriching experience for our audience as it has been for me. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. You've been so wonderful.
Thank you for the questions. And I'm in physical pain from the race. So I'm sorry for my grimace, but I'm so happy to see your smile and Rita's smile as well. It cheers me up.
Thank you so much.